Before the auction, blocks of Charleston and New Orleans stood ready to receive their human cargo. Before the cotton fields of Mississippi stretched white with unpicked bolls, there existed a vast and terrible machinery of capture along the coasts of West Africa. The transatlantic slave trade, that triangular commerce linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas, would transport approximately 12 million African souls across the Middle Passage between the 16th and 19th centuries, with nearly 400,000 eventually reaching North American shores. From the 15th century forward, European powers erected stone bastions along Africa's western rim, transforming beaches into markets and people into property. African intermediaries drawn into networks of profit and coercion conducted raids inland, severing kinship ties that had endured for generations. Ola Ekwano, captured as a boy in what is now Nigeria, would later recall, "The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo." The Middle Passage, that euphemism for oceanic horror, compressed human beings into the holds of vessels, where air itself became a luxury. Ships like the Brooks, whose infamous diagram circulated among abolitionists, illustrated the geometric precision of suffering. Bodies arranged like cargo, chained at wrist and ankle, lying in spaces measuring less than 16 in height. Disease spread through these floating coffins with ruthless efficiency. Dysentery, smallpox, and ophthalmia claimed lives by the thousand. Ship's logs recorded mortality with clerical detachment, noting losses as percentage points against projected profits. The slave ship Zong in 1781 would achieve particular infamy when its captain ordered 133 enslaved Africans thrown overboard to collect insurance money. A calculated decision that later sparked British abolitionist outrage. Ekwano described the passage with unflinching clarity. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. The smell, he wrote, became absolutely pestilential, causing many to prefer the release of suffocation to continued suffering. Some chose the depths over bondage, flinging themselves into the Atlantic when opportunity arose. Others mounted desperate rebellions aboard ship, though the odds against success remained overwhelming. The Middle Passage represented capitalism's most brutal calculus. Human flesh transformed into ledger entries, lives reduced to units of labor yet to be extracted. Between 1525 and 1866, approximately 12.5 million Africans were forced onto slave ships, though only 7 million survived to reach the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade constituted history's largest forced migration, scattering African peoples across the Western Hemisphere and fracturing entire civilizations. Those who survived the passage arrived transformed, not merely by trauma, but by a new legal reality that deemed them property, cattle, things rather than persons. They carried with them languages, beliefs, agricultural knowledge, and artistic traditions that would profoundly shape American culture, even as the system sought to erase their humanity entirely. Music on American soil, slavery's legal architecture took shape gradually, transforming what began as various forms of bound labor into a race-based system of perpetual hereditary enslavement. Virginia's colonial legislature crafted this transformation through successive statutes that stripped away legal protections and cemented black subjugation. The case of John Punch, an African servant who attempted escape in 1640, marked a crucial turning point. While his two white companions received extended terms of indenturous punishment, Punch was sentenced to servitude for life, the first known instance of lifetime enslavement imposed by a colonial court. By 1662, Virginia law established that children inherited their mother's status, ensuring slavery's reproduction through generations and incentivizing the exploitation of enslaved women's reproductive capacity. All children born in this country, the statute declared, shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. This legal innovation departed from English common law and created a self-perpetuating system where slavery expanded through birth rather than capture alone. The 1667 Virginia law further clarified that Christian baptism offered no path to freedom, severing the last potential link between religious conversion and manumission. The slave codes that proliferated across colonial America codified dehumanization into law. South Carolina's 1740 Negro Act, passed after the Stono Rebellion, represented comprehensive social control legislation. It prohibited enslaved people from growing their own food, assembling in groups, earning money, or learning to read. The law declared enslaved people to be absolute slaves and the objects of property in the hands of particular persons, explicitly defining human beings as things. Punishments for infractions included mutilation. If any slave shall run away and be gone from his or her master's or employer's service above 30 days, the code specified, such slave may be branded with the letter R on the right cheek. These legal frameworks spread throughout the South, creating variations on a common theme of surveillance and suppression. Slave patrols, armed white men authorized to stop, search, and discipline any black person found without proper documentation, became routine features of Southern life. Frederick Douglass would later describe how slaveholders have made it almost impossible for the slave to commit any crime known either to the laws of God or to the laws of man. If he steals, he takes his own. If he kills his master, he imitates only the heroes of the Revolution. Yet even in these early centuries, resistance flickered. The Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina saw approximately 20 enslaved people seize weapons from a store, march toward Florida's Spanish territory, which promised freedom to runaways, and grow to a force of 60 before colonial militia crushed their bid for liberty. 25 whites and 35 to 50 black rebels perished in the rebellion and its aftermath. The colonial response, stricter codes, increased patrols, heightened terror, revealed slavery's essential fragility, its perpetual dependence on violence to maintain control. Music Illy Whitney's Cotton Gin, patented in 1794, revolutionized Southern agriculture and sealed the fate of millions. This simple machine, which could clean 50 pounds of cotton daily compared to 1 pound by hand, transformed cotton from a marginal crop into the engine of American economic growth. Cotton is king, declared South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond in 1858, and the numbers bore him out. By 1860, cotton constituted 60% of American exports, and the United States produced 2/3 of the world's supply. This agricultural transformation created insatiable demand for enslaved labor. The domestic slave trade, the internal trafficking of human beings from the Upper South to the expanding cotton frontier, tore apart approximately 1 million enslaved people from their families between 1790 and 1860. The trade moved people from exhausted tobacco lands in Virginia and Maryland to fertile cotton territories in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. Professional traders like Isaac Franklin and John Armfield built fortunes on this commerce. Their firm, Franklin and Armfield, operated a sophisticated network, including slave pens in Alexandria, Virginia, and New Orleans, Louisiana, with ships transporting the enslaved along coastal routes. Solomon Northup, a free black man kidnapped into slavery in 1841, described the Alexandria pen operated by James Birch. In one part of it were slaves, in another was stored corn and bacon. The building, he noted, was a strong building standing near the center of the yard near the outside door, with small windows strongly barred looking out upon the yard. Here, hundreds waited before being marched south in coffles. Long lines of enslaved people, chained together at the wrists and ankles, forced to walk hundreds of miles to new owners in the deep South. The phrase "sold down the river" emerged from this terror. To enslaved people in Kentucky and other border states, the Mississippi River represented a geographic boundary beyond which conditions worsened dramatically. The sugar plantations of Louisiana and the cotton fields of Mississippi demanded labor so intensive that life expectancies dropped and family stability became nearly impossible. Charles Ball, sold from Maryland to South Carolina, recalled, "I knew very well that I was doomed to become a slave in Georgia or some of the southern states, and that it was useless to attempt escape from my present captives. I therefore set down my coffin and submitted to my fate." Cotton's kingdom required not just enslaved bodies, but skilled organization of their labor. The gang system, prevalent on large cotton plantations, divided workers into groups supervised by drivers, usually enslaved men granted authority in exchange for compliance. These drivers, working under white overseers, pushed their fellows to maintain productivity targets. Frederick Douglass described his plantation's overseer, Austin Gore, as a grave man, and though a young man, he indulged in no jokes, said no funny words, seldom smiled. Gore's severity embodied the calculated cruelty necessary to extract maximum labor from unwilling workers. Music New Orleans emerged as the epicenter of the domestic slave trade, its auction houses and showrooms processing thousands of enslaved people annually. The city's strategic position at the Mississippi River's mouth made it the natural terminus for coffles and ships bearing human cargo. By the 1850s, New Orleans boasted more slave traders than any other American city, with elegant establishments lining Chartres, St. Louis, and Barron streets, their facades masking the brutality within. The auctions themselves became theater, carefully choreographed performances designed to maximize sale prices while maintaining Gentile pretensions. Enslaved people were made to wash, dress in provided clothing, and present themselves for inspection. Solomon Northup described his experience at the New Orleans firm of Theophilus Freeman. "We were ordered to our places in certain positions on the floor an hour before the time of commencing the sale. Freeman, he noted, would make us hold up our heads, walk briskly back and forth, while customers would feel of our hands and arms and bodies, turn us about, ask us what we could do, make us open our mouths, and show our teeth precisely as a jockey examines a horse. The taxonomy of the trade developed specialized categories. Prime field hands, men aged 18 to 30, tall and muscular, commanded premium prices, sometimes exceeding $1,500. By the 1860s, fancy girls, young women of light complexion, were sold into sexual exploitation, often at private auctions where wealthy white men bid for concubines. This fancy trade operated as an open secret, with traders advertising fancy articles in euphemistic language that everyone understood. Harriet Jacobs, writing under the pseudonym Linda Brent, described being targeted by her enslaver's sexual pursuit. "My master began to whisper foul words in my ear. Young as I was, I could not remain ignorant of their import. The auction block became slavery's most potent symbol. Platforms, sometimes draped with bunting as if for celebration, elevated human beings for public scrutiny. Auctioneers employed practiced rhetoric to drive prices higher, emphasizing productivity, health, temperament, and skill. Newspaper advertisements promised a prime lot of Negroes or likely young Negro wenches. The Daily Picayune and other Southern papers dedicated entire sections to such notices, normalizing human commerce alongside advertisements for horses, furniture, and real estate. Family separations occurred with casual frequency. Traders generally preferred to break apart families as individuals fetched higher prices than groups. Solomon Northup witnessed a mother, Eliza, pleading with Theophilus Freeman not to separate her from her children. She promised in that case to be the most faithful slave that ever lived. The man answered that he could not afford it, and then Eliza burst into a paroxysm of grief, weeping plaintively. Freeman ordered her to stop or face the lash. Her daughter Emily was sold away. Her son Randolph followed shortly after. The remembrance of Eliza's tears, Northup wrote, is blotted from his memory. Music behind the auction houses' public facades lay a hidden architecture of confinement. The slave pens, jails, and holding facilities that formed the trade circulatory system. In major port cities and market towns, these structures warehoused human merchandise awaiting sale or transport. Richmond, Virginia, housed the notorious Lumpkins Jail, a complex that included cells, a yard, and an auction site locally known as the Devil's Half Acre. Robert Lumpkin, the proprietor, managed his enterprise with business-like efficiency, maintaining inventories, processing paperwork, and ensuring his stock remained presentable for buyers. Charles Ball described his confinement in a Washington slave pen. We were thrust into a large room on the lower floor of which was a number of strong iron chains fastened to rings in the floor. To these chains we were immediately attached by padlocks. The room contained no furniture save straw scattered on the floor. Guards monitored entrances, preventing escape and limiting contact with the outside world. These pens operated with legal sanction, protected by city ordinances and state laws that defined them as legitimate commercial establishments. The overland coffles represented slavery's most visible mobile manifestation. Long lines of enslaved people chained in pairs or groups marched hundreds of miles from the Upper South to Deep South markets. William Wells Brown himself, transported in a coffle, recalled, "A drove of human cattle are driven through the country until they reach the place of their destination," noting that the males, with few exceptions, are handcuffed to and the right hand of one to the left hand of another. Armed guards flanked these processions, ready to recapture anyone who attempted flight. At night, the coffles camped in fields or woods, the enslaved sleeping chained together while traders kept watch. The coastal trade offered a horrifying alternative to overland transport. Ships like those operated by Franklin and Armfield carried enslaved people from Chesapeake ports to New Orleans. The Tribune, a regular vessel in this trade, could transport 150 enslaved people in conditions reminiscent of the Middle Passage. Below deck, people lay packed together, denied adequate sanitation, ventilation, or movement. Solomon Northup endured such a voyage. We were all stiff and sore and could not move without difficulty. Before being taken from the brig, we were all obliged to shave, and those with beards to wash. Baltimore, Richmond, Charleston, Mobile, Natchez, and Memphis all developed robust slave trading infrastructures. In Charleston, Ryan's Mart on Charalma Street functioned as a major auction site. Its octagonal building featuring a central selling area surrounded by holding rooms. Advertisements promised likely Negroes and guaranteed good titles. In Richmond, the Shockob Bottom district concentrated trading firms their proximity to the James River, facilitating both riverine and overland transport. These urban spaces normalized human commerce, integrating it into cityscape and daily life. The traders themselves formed a professional class, often scorned socially, even as they accumulated wealth. Isaac Franklin began as a tavern keeper and died one of Tennessee's richest men. John Armfield managed the firm's Alexandria office with meticulous record-keeping, his ledgers documenting names, ages, prices, and destinations. Nathan Bedford Forrest, before gaining Confederate military fame, worked as a Memphis slave trader, buying and selling hundreds. These men understood their business's arithmetic, purchase prices in the Upper South, transport costs, markup potential in the Deep South, and the premium certain characteristics commanded in specific markets. Music, the plantation, slavery's primary production unit, organized space and time according to extraction's logic. Large cotton plantations in Mississippi and Alabama might hold 200 enslaved people. Smaller tobacco farms in Virginia, perhaps 20, regardless of scale, all shared common features. The quarters where enslaved people lived, the fields where they labored, the overseer's house from which surveillance emanated, and the owner's residence often elevated on a hill, architecturally asserting dominance. The quarters consisted of rough cabins, usually one-room structures housing entire families. Frederick Douglass described his childhood cabin. There was no wooden floor in our cabin, the naked clay being its floor. The door had not been pielked, and there was no glass in the window. By the cold of winter, the winds whistled and the snow blew in through the cracks. Furnishings remained sparse, perhaps a few wooden stools, straw pallets for sleeping, and basic cooking implements. Privacy was non-existent, family life unfolding in cramped conditions that denied personal space or dignity. Labor governed each day's rhythm. Field hands rose before dawn, assembled at the horn's summons, and worked until darkness. The cotton harvest, spanning fall months, demanded especially intensive labor. Each worker received a daily picking quota, sometimes 200, with shortfalls punished by lash. Solomon Northup, forced to work Louisiana cotton fields, described the regime. An ordinary day's work is 200. A slave who is accustomed to picking is punished if he or she brings in a less quantity than that. The overseer weighed each sack at day's end, maintaining precise records of productivity. The task system, more common on rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia's Low Country, assigned specific work units rather than time-based labor. Once a worker completed their assigned task, perhaps a quarter-acre of rice cultivation, they controlled their remaining time. This system paradoxically offered slightly more autonomy while demanding intense labor during task completion. Charles Ball noted that under the task system, a slave who is temperate and can work steadily can do his task by 2 or 3:00. Skilled enslaved craftspeople, blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, seamstresses, wheelwrights, occupied slightly elevated positions within plantation hierarchies. Their specialized knowledge made them valuable, sometimes allowing negotiation of better conditions or limited mobility. Frederick Douglass learned corking in Baltimore shipyards, skills that later facilitated his escape, yet even skilled workers remained subject to sale, punishment, and arbitrary treatment. Their expertise increased market value, but offered no protection against the system's fundamental violence. House servants endured distinct vulnerabilities. Proximity to owners meant constant surveillance, intrusion into personal life, and particular susceptibility to exploitation. Harriet Jacobs described her grandmother's position. She was all in all to her young mistress, and was so faithful that she was trusted with all her white friends' secrets. Yet this trust extended only to service, not to basic human recognition. House servants witnessed owners' private moments, absorbed education denied them, and faced daily reminders of the gap between their capabilities and their status. Violence formed slavery's essential grammar. the language through which the system communicated and maintained itself. Physical punishment was not aberrant, but central, not excessive, but routine. Frederick Douglass witnessed his Aunt Ha's whipping, an experience that haunted him lifelong. He took her into the kitchen and stripped her from neck to waist. After crossing her hands, he tied them with a strong rope and led her to a stool under a large hook in the joist put in for the purpose. He made her get upon the stool and tied her hands to the hook. He then said to her, "I'll learn you how to disobey my orders." The whip, usually made of cowhide or similar leather, became slavery's ubiquitous tool. Overseers carried them constantly, their presence a perpetual threat. Solomon Northup described being whipped for failing to meet his cotton quota. "I was given 10 lashes, and then calling Abram, who was standing near, the overseer told him to go to the quarters and get me a gourd of salt and water. The salt solution applied to lacerated flesh intensified agony and infection. Such calculated cruelty aimed not merely to punish specific infractions, but to instill pervasive terror, making each enslaved person's body a site of potential suffering." Branding, though declining by the 19th century, remained in use. Runaways might be branded with R on the cheek or shoulder, marking them permanently as flight risks and reducing resale value. Iron collars, devices locked around necks, sometimes featuring protruding spikes to prevent sleep, punished persistent escape attempts. The iron muzzle, a mask locked over the face, prevented eating and speaking, transforming the wearer into spectacle of absolute subjugation. Charles Ball described seeing enslaved people wearing iron collars with long prongs or horns, and sometimes bells attached to them, and chains which they were compelled to drag after them at their labor. State slave codes provided legal architecture for this violence. Virginia law declared, "It shall be lawful for any person or persons to kill and destroy any enslaved person found in any act of resistance to his or their lawful owner." South Carolina code specified that every slave who shall steal or destroy any goods, chattels, or provisions of any kind would receive such corporal punishment as the justice or justices trying such slaves shall think fit, not extending to life or limb. The law thus authorized calculated brutality while pretending to restrain it, a fiction that owners ignored when convenient. Slave patrols enforced control beyond plantation boundaries. These groups required of white men by law in many counties ranged roads at night, stopping any black person encountered and demanding documentation of authorized travel. Patrols could enter slave quarters without warning, searching for weapons, contraband literature, or evidence of assembly. They disrupted religious services, broke up gatherings, and administered punishment for perceived infractions. Frederick Douglass described them, "I have known them to knock down and tie up men and women and lash them with cow skins and hickories until the blood flowed." The legal system itself constituted an apparatus of oppression. Enslaved people could not testify in court against white persons, rendering legal protection impossible. They could be tried and executed for crimes, but denied due process protections. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 extended slaveholders' reach into free states, requiring northern authorities and citizens to assist in capturing runaways. The law denied alleged fugitives jury trials or the right to testify, making kidnapping of free black people trivially easy. Solomon Northup's 12-year ordeal in bondage began with kidnapping in Washington, D.C., facilitated by this legal framework. Music resistance manifested across a spectrum from quiet refusal to armed rebellion. Enslaved people developed sophisticated forms of covert resistance, working slowly, feigning illness, damaging tools, spoiling crops, These actions, difficult to prove intentional, allowed assertion of will while minimizing punishment risk. Frederick Douglass explained, "I never found a slave who had not a keen sense of justice. They learned to regard slavery as a robbery and slaveholders as the robbers. Escape represented more overt resistance, though success remained rare and perilous. Henry Box Brown achieved legendary status by having himself shipped in a wooden crate from Richmond to Philadelphia in 1849. He spent 27 hours in a 3-foot box, enduring heat, thirst, and multiple instances of the crate being turned upside down. Upon arrival, he emerged singing. Ellen and William Craft executed an audacious escape in 1848. Ellen, light-skinned, disguised herself as a white male slaveholder, while William posed as his servant. They traveled openly by train and steamboat from Georgia to Philadelphia, their boldness making the ruse credible. The Underground Railroad, neither underground nor a railroad, formed a loose network of routes, safe houses, and individuals who assisted runaways heading north. Harriet Tubman herself escaped from Maryland in 1849, returned to slave territory repeatedly, conducting approximately 13 rescue missions and guiding roughly 70 people to freedom. She carried a pistol both for protection and to discourage any rescued person from turning back. Discovery of network would endanger all. "I never ran my train off the track," she declared, "and I never lost a passenger." William Still, a free black man in Philadelphia, coordinated Underground Railroad activities and meticulously documented hundreds of cases, preserving names, origins, and escape narratives. His records revealed the network's scope and the courage required for participation. Levi Coffin, a Quaker in Indiana, reportedly assisted more than 3,000 fugitives. Thomas Garrett in Delaware aided hundreds, continuing despite being sued by a slaveholder and losing his property. These individuals risked legal consequences, financial ruin, and sometimes violence. Armed resistance represented the most dangerous form of defiance. Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia, shocked the South profoundly. Turner, an enslaved preacher, led a group that moved from farm to farm over 2 days, resulting in the demise of approximately 60 white people. The rebellion was ultimately suppressed, and Turner and others faced execution. The retribution extended far beyond participants. Virginia militia and white mobs took the lives of more than 100 enslaved and free black people. Afterward, Virginia debated emancipation briefly before instead tightening restrictions prohibiting teaching enslaved people to read and curtailing free black people's rights. Gabriel Prosser in 1800 and Denmark Visuai in 1822 planned large-scale uprisings that were betrayed before execution. Both faced execution along with numerous alleged conspirators, their trials marked by dubious testimony and forced confessions. Yet these conspiracies, whether fully formed or partially fabricated by paranoid authorities, revealed slavery's unstable foundation. The very need for such pervasive surveillance and violence demonstrated that enslaved people never accepted their condition, that resistance smoldered constantly beneath apparent compliance. Enslaved people forged distinct cultural and spiritual lives despite systematic attempts to prevent community formation. Religion became particularly significant, offering both comfort and resistance framework. Plantation Christianity, as taught by white preachers, emphasized submission. Servants, obey your masters. Yet enslaved people transformed these teachings, emphasizing biblical narratives of liberation. Moses leading Israelites from Egypt, Daniel surviving the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego emerging unscathed from the furnace. Secret religious meetings held in woods or quarters after work hours allowed authentic worship beyond white oversight. The invisible institution of independent black Christianity flourished in these hidden spaces. Participants placed wet quilts or overturned pots at doors to muffle sound, hoping to avoid patrol detection. Frederick Douglass described such gatherings. We would sometimes sing a spiritual that carried double meaning, a meaning for the slave and another for the master. Spirituals like Wade in the Water and Swing Low Sweet Chariot functioned as coded communication, their lyrics referencing escape and freedom. Music and storytelling preserved African cultural elements while adapting to American circumstances. Call and response patterns, polyrhythmic drumming when permitted, and ring shouts, circular spiritual dances maintained African aesthetic sensibilities. Folktales featuring trickster figures, Brer Rabbit outwitting stronger opponents, allowed enslaved people to celebrate cleverness, triumphing over brute force. These narratives, entertaining on surface, carried subversive messages about resistance and survival. Family structures persisted despite constant threat of separation. Enslaved people created kinship networks extending beyond blood relations, building community support systems that provided child care, emotional sustenance, and mutual aid. Jumping the broom, a marriage ritual, sanctified unions that law refused to recognize. Couples pledged commitment knowing any separation could occur without warning, their vows expressing hope amid precarity. Naming practices preserved memory. Children bore names of sold or deceased relatives, maintaining connection across ruptures. Limited material culture revealed creativity within constraint. Enslaved women sewed quilts using scraps, sometimes incorporating patterns with coded meanings. Craftspeople fashioned tools, carved wood, and wove baskets, using techniques passed through generations. Food preparation adapted African culinary traditions to available ingredients, creating distinctive Southern cuisine. Gardens surrounding quarters provided supplemental nutrition and small zones of autonomy. These cultural practices constituted resistance, assertions of humanity and continuity that slavery sought to obliterate. Education, though prohibited, proceeded clandestinely. Frederick Douglass learned to read from a slaveholder's wife until her husband forbade it, declaring that learning would spoil the best in the world. This prohibition revealed literacy's power. Reading enabled access to abolitionist literature, legal documents, passes required for travel, and broader understanding of the world. Some enslaved people taught themselves laboriously, learning letters from whatever sources they could access. Others attended covert schools, risking severe punishment for knowledge. Music opposition to slavery emerged gradually, evolving from isolated moral objections into organized political movement. Early abolitionists included Quakers whose religious principles rejected human bondage. Benjamin Lay, an 18th century Quaker, performed dramatic protests. Once he brought a hollow-out Bible filled with red liquid to a Quaker meeting and splattered it on slaveholders, declaring, "Thus shall God shed the blood of those persons who enslave their fellow creatures." The Second Great Awakening religious fervor energized 19th century abolitionism. William Lloyd Garrison, whose newspaper, The Liberator, commenced publication in 1831, demanded immediate emancipation without compensation to slaveholders. His first editorial declared, "I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice." On this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. Garrison burned copies of the Constitution, which he called a covenant with death and an agreement with hell for its protections of slavery. Frederick Douglass emerged as abolitionism's most powerful black voice. His 1845 narrative became an international bestseller, its eloquence refuting claims of black intellectual inferiority. Douglass lectured throughout the North and in Britain, his first-hand testimony compelling. "You have seen how a man was made a slave," he wrote. "You shall see how a slave was made a man. He broke with Garrison over political strategy, advocating engagement with political institutions rather than rejection of a corrupted system. Douglass's newspaper, the North Star, took its name from the celestial guide that runaways followed toward freedom. Women played crucial roles despite exclusion from formal political participation. The Grimm K sisters, Sarah and Angelina, raised in a South Carolina slaveholding family, became fierce abolitionists and women's rights advocates. Sojourner Truth, born into slavery in New York, traveled and preached after gaining freedom. Her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech challenging both racial and gender discrimination. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, reached enormous audiences, though sentimentalized and problematic in its depictions. The novel shifted Northern public opinion and drew international attention to slavery's cruelty. Black abolitionists formed independent organizations, recognizing that white-led groups often marginalized African American voices. The Negro Convention movement, beginning in 1830, provided forums for debate about strategy and goals. David Walker's 1829 appeal to the colored citizens of the world called for resistance by any means necessary, alarming slaveholders with its militancy. "Let every man of color throughout the United States of America," Walker urged, "who tamely submits to the chains of slavery, compare his miserable condition with the condition of a free man." The Amistad case of 1839 captured national attention when enslaved Africans led by Joseph Sink seized control of the Cuban schooner, transporting them, and attempted to sail back to Africa. The ship eventually landed in Connecticut, where the captives faced trial. Former President John Quincy Adams argued their case before the Supreme Court, successfully securing their freedom and return to Africa. The case demonstrated that even within a system protecting slavery, specific instances could be challenged when law and morality intersected favorably. John Brown represented abolitionism's militant edge. His 1859 raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, intended to spark a general slave uprising, failed militarily but succeeded symbolically. Brown's willingness to employ violence against slavery and his composure before execution made him martyr to some, fanatic to others. Frederick Douglass, who had advised against the raid, later reflected, "His zeal in the cause of my race was far greater than mine. It was as the burning sun to my taper light." Music. The Civil War transformed slavery from political controversy into existential crisis. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued January 1, 1863, declared enslaved people in rebelling states forever free. The proclamation's limitations: it exempted Union-controlled areas, revealed pragmatic calculation. Yet its symbolic power proved immense. Enslaved people had already been self-emancipating, fleeing to Union lines throughout the war. The proclamation legitimized their freedom and authorized black military service. Nearly 200,000 black men served in Union forces, their participation accelerating slavery's destruction. Freedom arrived irregularly, its pace determined by Union military advance. In Texas, the war's end came unacknowledged until June 19, 1865, when General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston proclaiming liberation. This date, Junth, became a freedom celebration observed annually by black communities. The moment's joy mingled with uncertainty. Freedom meant possibility, but also vulnerability. Formerly enslaved people faced reuniting scattered families, establishing economic independence, and navigating a hostile social order that resisted their citizenship. The 13th Amendment, ratified December 1865, abolished slavery throughout the nation, except as punishment for crime, a loophole that would enable convict leasing and mass incarcerations. Racial disparities. Reconstruction briefly promised transformation. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship. The 15th extended voting rights to black men. Black political participation flourished. Men like Hiram Rebels and Blanche K. Bruce served in the U.S. Senate, while hundreds held state and local offices. Freed men's schools educated those denied literacy, and land distribution seemed possible. Yet this promise collapsed. White Southern resistance through violence, legislation, and economic coercion dismantled Reconstruction's gains. The Compromise of 1877 withdrew federal troops, abandoning black Southerners to state control. Convict leasing enslaved thousands under legal pretexts. Sharecropping trapped families in debt ponage, reproducing plantation labor relations without formal ownership. Jim Crow laws imposed segregation, disenfranchisement, and subordination. Lynching terrorized communities with thousands subjected to extrajudicial execution between 1877 and 1950. Slavery's legacy persisted through generations. The wealth gap between black and white Americans traces directly to slavery's unpaid labor and Reconstruction's failure to redistribute land. Housing discrimination, employment barriers, and educational inequities reinforced disadvantage. The Great Migration saw millions flee Southern oppression for northern cities, seeking opportunities yet encountering different forms of discrimination. Civil rights movements of the 20th century continued. Struggles begun during slavery for dignity, equality, and justice. Memory itself became contested terrain. Confederate monuments erected during Jim Crow celebrated slaveholders and obscured slavery's violence. Lost cause mythology romanticized the antebellum South, erasing enslaved people's suffering. Only gradually did public history shift, incorporating enslaved people's perspectives through preserved narratives, archaeological excavations, and descendant testimony. Museums like the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Whitney Plantation Museum in Louisiana center enslaved people's experiences, making visible what was long suppressed. The auction block endures as symbol of commodification, separation, and dehumanization, but also of survival, resistance, and the human capacity to endure unspeakable injustice while maintaining dignity and hope. The formerly enslaved and their descendants built communities, institutions, and movements that transformed America. Their stories, preserved through narrative, testimony, and memory, demand recognition not merely as tragedy, but as testament to resilience, creativity, and the enduring struggle for freedom and human recognition in a nation still reckoning with slavery's profound and lasting consequences. Music